Hello to whoever is watching this. This video is about the German occupation in Belgium during World War I, the game of basketball, and the importance these two things have for understanding Rawls' essay, Two Concepts of Rules. Now, our story starts over 100 years ago when Germany invades Belgium because they were declaring war on France and needed to pass through Belgium in order to outflank the Western Front in something Germany called the Schlieffen Plan. This, of course, was all because Austria declared war on Serbia, who was allied with Russia, who then declared war on Austria, which made Germany declare war on France because France was Russia's ally, and that was all because of a Serbian nationalist group called the Black Hand had assassinated a guy named the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Anyhow, at the time, Belgium was unprepared for war, so they capitulated almost immediately, leaving them under German occupation. Now, if you have someone who is stomping through your house uninvited, burning everything down, breaking your furniture, you're gonna want to confront them. Now, with Belgium, the civilians didn't really have the option of calling the police or confronting them anymore because their military had lost to Germany. What they did have left, however, was resistance through guerrilla operations or hit-and-run tactics. While not everybody in Belgium was able to resist, the few numbers of people who did were quite annoying to the Germans. Bridges were getting blown up and rail lines were getting destroyed, all in an attempt to hurt the German supply lines running through towards the Western Front. Now, because they were guerrilla operations, the soldiers ran away, and most of the time, they weren't getting caught. So what do you do if you're Germany and you can't catch these guerrillas, but at the same time you want to punish and stop their resistance? Well, the Germans used something called collective punishment, where they would execute entire towns and families for any act of perceived resistance. They thought if they weren't able to catch individuals, at the very least to stop that subversion, they could punish the community and in that way discourage more acts of resistance in the future. And here, we've now entered a discussion on moral theory because we can support the German action by using utilitarian arguments. Utilitarianism has been a popular moral theory, with the first notable supporters being John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham. The main idea suggests that our moral actions can be determined by whether or not we are able to maximize an intrinsic good among our moral community. We could choose to maximize pleasure, happiness, or well-being, but whichever good we might choose, our goal in justifying our actions comes only from the consequences, regardless of any intent or motive. And this means we could justify killing a village or innocent civilians if we find those benefits outweigh the gruesome acts we have to carry out. Sure, a loving mother and her children might get sacrificed. But if this can discourage Belgium guerrillas from destroying more bridges, which would in turn greatly benefit the countless Germans fighting on the front lines, who are putting their lives in danger to protect the innocent families back in Germany, then we could support punishing innocent civilians. The obvious problem with this justification, which I'm sure you're thinking, is that this tactic sounds irredeemable and reprehensible, something we should never do even if we have some moral magic wand telling us to do so. In fact, the 1949 Geneva Conventions would agree with that instinct, because it labels collective punishment as a war crime, not just in US law, but international law, stating in Article 33, no protected person may be punished for an offense he or she has not personally committed. But why is that? Aren't moral theories supposed to guide us towards dividing true differences between right and wrong actions? Does this mean our moral theories fail? As a response, John Rawls explains in his seminal paper, Two Concepts of Rules, this apparent failure merely comes from a different sort of failure: the failure to recognize the importance of a distinction between a practice and actions falling within the practice. We can begin to conceptualize what Rawls means by the way we might make any set of rules. Take basketball. Between 1891 and 1892, at a YMCA gymnasium in Springfield, Massachusetts, there's a group of bored college students who were looking for sports to play after the football season ended, and they couldn't play outside during the cold winter months anymore. This was until a graduate student named James Naismith came up with the idea of a new game that could be played indoors during winter months, and it would be just as fun as rigorous outside sports. He first thought about other games, like soccer, football, where teams pass the ball to each other, which led him to think whatever game he came up with should also use a ball. He then thought about scoring, so Naismith got a hold of the school janitor, asking if he had any extra boxes or garbage cans that could be used as goals. The janitor didn't have either of those, so he came back with some peach baskets instead. And there you have it. He had some balls and baskets and invented basketball. He came up with 13 original rules, which included the methods of scoring as well as fouls, and eventually turning into the game we have today, played in high schools across the United States, colleges, and the NBA. Of course, what we have looks quite different than the original game with some peach baskets, but at the same time, there's the underlying set of rules players have to follow with the design interest of having fun. Sure, if a person on one team has a basketball, it'd be really advantageous for the other team to tackle them and take the ball away from them by force. On the other hand, if you're losing by a lot of points in a game, it might be nice to declare that the least amount of points on a team wins the game of basketball. But for obvious reasons, we don't do either of these, because that would destroy the very meaning of what it means to play the game of basketball in the first place. Now relate this with the way we think about punishment. In both basketball and our legal system, people come together and agree upon a certain set of rules in a way designed to maximize our underlying interest. How would you answer if your little brother asks, "Why do people go to jail in the first place?" We might say it's because she robbed a bank, and by doing that she breaks the law. She was duly tried fairly in a court of law, so she's going to jail as a result. And to your little brother, that would probably be an alright answer. But we could have also taken another approach to that same question and answer why she's going to jail in the first place. We could say her crime was the result of circumstance and socio-political machinations of our justice system, which punish people in lower economic standing and racial minorities in unequal proportion, which stands as a system perpetuating status quo of the people in positions of power who make these laws in the first place. Which your little brother would probably say, "Thank you, but I'm only 6 years old." Now, in all seriousness, we could take this with two different views, two different respects. A retroactive view, where we look at the past and explain why people are punished, or a prospective view, where we look to the future and underlying goals of our laws. Whereas the judge will enforce policies enacted by a statute, the underlying statute must first be passed by a legislator with a specific goal in mind. Taking this a step further, when acting any law, we could use a utilitarian argument in order to promote the betterment of our society. Not necessarily because we want to punish people in a sense of fairness, but because as a utilitarian, we want to illegalize theft because we have a public interest for maximizing well-being, and it is best served by a policy for protecting our private property. When someone breaks the law, then we would be acting in retribution, punishing a person for breaking the underlying law, which serves the interest of our public safety. So go back to our analogy. With basketball, college students were looking for a cure for boredom. With laws, the utilitarian looks towards maximizing well-being. For this reason, we can say laws and basketball both follow what can be called a practice conception. meaning their framework comes logically prior to the decision-making process for our actions. On the other hand, earlier when we were justifying collective punishment during World War I, we were only appealing towards the general utilitarian principle rather than any practice which our actions must fall under. Assume collective punishment must conform itself to a statute. What would it look like? Whatever it is, it would have to permit public officials to execute civilians without evidence, without culpability, and therefore give unchecked power to government officials and undermine the utilitarian goal. We have identified a problem with this collective punishment because earlier we were justifying the action without elaborating the underlying conditions making it possible. Another way of putting it, earlier we justified a summary conception of the rule rather than a practice conception. Now, taking individual cases one at a time, we can form rules of thumb in a way that our actions would become logically prior to any guideline or rule we have. Suppose a doctor finds out their patient is fatally ill, so she decides against telling the patient about the condition in order to maximize the patient's happiness. In the future, this doctor comes to have more patients who are also fatally ill, so she also decides to hold the truth from them and develops a rule of thumb where generally it is wrong to tell patients about their fatally ill diseases. Other doctors might do the same thing and come up with the same rules. But at the same time, because the doctor's justification comes from utilitarian principle itself, there may be cases which contradict this rule of thumb, and these exceptions, she will not be appealing to the summary rules, rather she must be appealing towards the goal of maximizing the well-being of her patients. Somebody might be better off knowing about what's going to happen to them, knowing that they're going to lose their life. In this sense, Rawls describes our actions come logically prior to a summary conception of a rule, and these rule of thumb cases are unique from the way we conceptualize punishment. Rawls specifically defines the term punishment to mean whenever someone is deprived of their normal rights on the grounds that the individual has violated a rule of law. In other words, there is a difference between killing and punishing innocent people for the purpose of maximizing well-being for the public interest. Punishing requires a law which enacts a retributive form, whereby we deprive individuals of the rights in proportion with the wrongs they've committed. No law could be justified according to this utilitarian principle, which would permit punishing individuals, because as stated earlier, it would grant unchecked power to government officials, which would run against those utilitarian grounds. Once we come to accept punishment follows this practice conception, we cannot arbitrarily run against the practice it enforces. In the same way, we cannot tackle people in basketball. The rules we establish are themselves what we must appeal to, not the utilitarian framework. If we want to tackle someone in basketball, we would no longer be playing basketball, and alternative rules would require a change within the game itself. So it is in light of these reasons we find the importance of a distinction between a practice and actions which fall within the practice. Our moral theories are designed, ideally, to break misguided conventional wisdom. We do not want to find ourselves justifying gruesome acts and war crimes by appealing towards misguided application of moral theories. Without making this distinction, we'd be liable to killing innocent civilians. However, as we've seen from World War I, the German occupation in Belgium, to the very creation of basketball with James Naismith, we must distinguish between practices and the actions which fall under those practices. Otherwise, we are liable for moral error. Thank you. This has been my PHL 245 video project, and I appreciate you for listening. Peace.